Behind me is the beautiful Bear River, which forms right on the border of Utah and Idaho. And in 1822, the first company of white fur trappers crossed the Continental Divide and kind of set up their fur trapping camp here. And I wanted to tell two stories. One is John Henry Weber, and the other is William Skeen Ogden. Now, both Weber and Ogden are now towns in Utah for reasons which I'll talk about. But these guys came up, Weber did, because he was a German-born fur trapper, and he decided to go out west and make a name for himself, but he was an independent fur trapper. He wasn't part of a larger company. Now, after a few years, he meets Ashley's 100, and he decides to befriend them, and he quickly is making a name for himself as this awesome outdoorsman with all of these survival skills and excellent skills with the natives. So he leads a company of men down through South Pass, which later became a very important route on the Old Oregon Trail. I'm standing in the middle of beautiful South Pass, Wyoming, and the story of this pass is the story of some of the earliest exploration of the American West. In 1806, when Lewis and Clark passed through, they went along the Yellowstone River at the northern part of the state of Wyoming, and they had no idea that this place existed. But this was the established route for fur trappers for several years after. But in 1812, a company led by John Jacob Astor decided that they should continue along the Yellowstone River, but there was a Crow Indian threat going on. The Crow were warriors, and so Robert Stewart basically petitioned Astor to let him gather 6 people, and they would continue south and just see what they found. Now, they could have found something much more dangerous than the Crow threat, and I think that this is something which speaks to the pioneering attitude. They headed out into the wilderness having no idea what was down here, and they discovered this. And Stewart remarked that it was basically a secret back door to the Great Basin. So by 1823, a member of William Henry Ashley's 100, Jedediah Smith, he decided to lead an expedition along this pass. And it all begins in 1812 when a party of men broke off from John Jacob Astor because they feared the Crow warriors to the north. And that cemented it as a vital backbone to the settlement of the West. And he comes up over the mountains and he sets up camp here. Now, Ashley later sets up camp here as well, and eventually they meet with William Skeen Ogden, who is a British colonial official. Now, at the time, you had the Oregon Country conflict. Now, it was jointly administered by Britain and by America, but there was still tension between the two countries, as you can imagine. The War of 1812 was only a decade ago. So there's an argument which breaks out, which almost results in a war. Now, Ogden says this is jointly administered, and the Americans say, you know, to hell with that, we planted the flag, we were here first, and also, you know, we're not going to kill you, but we're going to offer all of the Iroquois in your company, because there's something like 30 Iroquois, we'll just give them better pay and say come over to America's side. So Ogden now finds himself with a company of only 5 or 6 men in hostile country hundreds of miles away from any other outpost of the British Empire, so he hightails it up to Flathead House in Montana. So this is used for the next few years. They're hunting, and then they go down to Cache Valley where they hide all of their furs, and after a few years of hunting in Wyoming and Idaho and Montana and Utah, they take the furs and they head back out. But in the meantime, 1827 to 1828, they had the first Rocky Mountain rendezvous held here at the south end of the lake, which I'm going to go over to the springs where that was held and talk a little bit about that. But by all accounts, you actually had Hugh Glass from The Revenant coming out and telling his stories. You had Jim Bridger telling his stories. In fact, Jim Bridger's stories were so wonderful, they put him on a raft and sent him down the river, and he discovered the Great Salt Lake, probably the first white man to do so. And this lake, even though it's kind of just a spot to visit in the summer for a lot of people and go swimming, it has some of the most fascinating history of the fur trappers and Rocky Mountain wild men that you could possibly find out west. And I want you to think, as they put this word out, you would have Indian messengers running through the hills delivering this message to the Rocky Mountain wild men, because if you lived in a canyon, the odds are pretty much everybody in the local tribes would know who you were and where you were, and it would say, meet us at the southern edge of Bear Lake. So they would head here, and pretty much any way you approach Bear Lake, it's surrounded by mountains. and from the top of the mountain, you would almost assuredly see the campfires rising from where I'm standing right now. Dozens, if not hundreds, of wild men and thousands of Native Americans all selling to each other and making deals. In fact, Covington said that when you would be hired on to work for Sublette, it was a 12 to 14 month contract and it was $250, which was truly a fortune in the 1820s. You could buy anything you wanted, and they had apparently pretty decent provisions as well. So this was very much a blessing for a lot of the wild men who lived out here in the mountains. About a mile north of me now, at the southern terminus of Bear Lake, is Rendezvous Beach, and it's called that because a lot of people mistakenly believe that the first Rocky Mountain rendezvous happened there. In reality, it happened at Falula Spring, which is no longer really visible. It's only 20 feet over to my right. And we know this because a man by the name of Philip Covington, he was getting older in 1879, living in a cabin north of Denver, and he decided to write down his experiences as a young mountain man. Now, like many people, he was kind of just wandering the plains and the deserts by himself when he was picked up by William Ashley. They went over the plains to Laramie, and by that point he'd kind of gotten the stories of other men in Ashley's fur company and discovered that a lot of them were gathered from the plains of the Dakotas in the Indian Wars. So they went up to Laramie, and there was kind of a war with the Blackfeet as they continued further. All of their mules had died of just freezing cold temperatures, so now all of these men are just on foot, freezing to death, trekking over the Continental Divide after, the 1822 expedition had already reached here. They knew they could make it here, and they knew the path, but they were slowly dying along the way. And the Blackfeet were kind of a permanent mark on the plains and prairies. They were always very aggressive towards outsiders, so there was a war and they sent out a search party, and one of Covington's writings, which is fascinating, is they sent out an expedition to go kill as many Blackfeet as they could, and they came back with a huge haul of Blackfeet scalps, and the wild men, along with a couple of friendly Indians in their party, they had a war dance all to their own. And they come over here, and by 1827 and early 1828, they have a rendezvous here at this very spring. And you had Jim Bridger, you had Hugh Glass telling his story with the bear, and by that time Hugh Glass was a fixture on the Wild West. People knew it was like the Revenant back in the day. Everyone knew who Hugh Glass was. And then you had Sublette of the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, who comes down, and in 1827 and 28 he starts recruiting a lot of Ashley's men to go over to the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. And throughout this rendezvous, you see people who went from living in the mountains, refusing to even give their name, people who were fleeing from society. You would see them demonstrating their feats of courage, how well they could shoot an arrow, how well they could ride a horse and stand up on its back. And you would have people dueling with each other over the love of Indian women. And this would happen all the time. And these are some of the craziest places in the entire world, I would think. The most true Wild West picture that we can think of, with the wild men either allying against the Indians, making deals with Indians, making treaties, and 99% of it was never written down because these were truly men who just wanted to live off the grid. Now, this is where it all happened, right here at the southern part of Bear Lake. We're here on the western shore of Bear Lake, and I'm zooming in on Falula Springs now, where the first Rocky Mountain Rendezvous of 1827 and early 1828 took place. And when people back east had heard of this rendezvous, they figured it would be easy enough to settle in Oregon or California themselves. But the problem with that is in 1827, as the rendezvous was heading west, all of their pack mules died. As far east of here is Fort Laramie, Wyoming, kind of eastern Wyoming. So the settlers took a couple years in establishing their own trail, and by 1830 they had found a way to get their own wagons over, because it's one thing to go west on foot and another thing entirely to bring your entire family on a wagon. I mean, you can hike up over a mountain, but good luck getting your car over there. So they made their way over to the southern part of Bear Lake. Now, they would have used Falula Springs to kind of water their own pack animals, but we don't really know where the first Oregon Trail was. As far as Indian stories tell us, and marks on rocks and trees, we think that it came up over the southern shores of the lake, headed up north on this road, and northwest of here would have gone through a canyon, leading them through the Bear River and into Idaho, where they probably would have hopped on the Snake River, where the Oregon Trail was eventually more firmly established. And as this car passes, one second, This is the monument to the first Oregon Trail. It actually mentions the first rendezvous of 1827 by name and date, and it's kind of interesting to see that all of these trails blazed by the pioneers are still used today. I mean, 99% of this trail still has a road on it, or at least very near to it. Welcome to Names Hill, Wyoming. I've actually passed by this spot quite a few times before, and I would have stopped here a lot sooner if I would have realized that Jim Bridger left his mark up on the wall behind me in 1844. Now, a lot of people dispute this because Jim Bridger was illiterate, but even being illiterate back in the day, a lot of people would learn to sign their own names. And this signature is also pretty deeply cut. It looks more recent, but, you know, the old archaeological practice was, let me just touch that up with a screwdriver. So it could very likely be him, and certainly it's on the path of the old immigrant trail, which would get you to Fort Bridger, you know, kind of his mountain man fort that he helped establish right along the old cutoff. And the story here is that immigrants would go over 40 miles of desert without any sources of water, and then they would get here to this nice little idyllic valley, and they would be able to kind of graze their cattle on the land. They could let their horses get some more water, and they would camp right along this beautiful cliff face. And a lot of these carvings from trappers, they date back to before the Plains Indians were even here, or not before they were here, but, you know, they're contemporary with Native American pictographs along the old cliff face. And because the roads followed these old immigrant trails and explorers and fur trappers, you have a highway going right next to it. I've had to film this thing 10 times to keep a semi-truck out of the audio, but you can see people here that are carving their name, you know, from the Great Depression, a self-proclaimed gambler who's probably on his way to Vegas. And this is kind of the exploration of the West, and I think it's really fascinating to see how all of it ties together. And the first group of people to pass through here would have likely been the 1820s. You had Jedediah Smith and you had Jim Bridger passing through to get to Bear Lake. So this would have been an established route on the Explorers Trail by the time, you know, the Donner Party or the Mormons or the California Gold Rush came through. And everybody would have remembered this pretty fondly along their way. Over there is Jim Bridger's signature, and you can tell by coming up along the cliff face here that there is basically an uninterrupted line of signatures. You have the 1930s, the 1970s, the axle grease from larger immigrant trains, the 1890s, and then as you come along here further, you can see an entire cliff face, and these would have all been people who just were resting to let their animals recuperate. And a couple of these are from the early 1850s, even 1850 itself. And I want to find a couple interesting ones. I mean, here I believe that says 1852, perhaps, 1949, a couple of 22 caliber shots, it looks like, small plinks in the wall. I know I saw quite a few. There's one guy from Ohio that came out, right here, Charles Saviors, Ohio, 1850. Captain H.G. Nickerson actually left his signature like he professionally carved it, 1914. More bullet holes in the wall up here, unfortunately. But, I mean, you always have idiots who do things like that. 1878, that could have been the Gold Rush. Greer, J.C. Greer, that is 1845, which is really fascinating to think about because that's before the Mormons ever got out here. That is a fur trapper. And I mean, a fur trapper. This is way before anything else had really been explored out here. So these guys would have actually been very friendly with the Native Americans for the most part, because the Native Americans hadn't experienced kind of these negative things on behalf of the U.S. government as a whole. They were only experiencing these fur trappers. And the fur trappers already had a mistrust for authority. So a lot of times they commiserated with the Native Americans, saying, we're fleeing from a government we don't like, and, you know, we sort of like the government, but we can understand your grievances against them. Over here, just a trapper named James from 1830. One of the earlier ones. That's even before Jim Bridger was here. And a lot of these, because mythology came around later, that perhaps people would have got here way earlier and they were adding signatures to kind of establish my family was here a decade before your family. So there's no way of confirming any of these. Even Jim Bridger, like I said earlier, lots of questions about whether or not that was him. 1852, J.L. Grill, before the Mormon Wars, or J.L. Gill. H.P. Widger, 1850, again before the Utah War, because that happened in 1857. I've heard there are a couple of kind of advanced scouts from the Utah War who left their mark on this canyon. They were waiting for the army under Johnston to arrive. And I mean, you've got some Mormon pioneers here. R. Christ, July 1852. Let's see if I hope this is all showing up nicely in the camera. And here's an interesting one. J.G. Guthrie, a U.S. sailor of California from October 1880. And would you look at that? Richard Potter could very well be the brother of Ike Potter, because Potter and his father both started the Ike Potter gang after there was a blood feud with the local bishop who sealed his marriage to Ike Potter's deceased wife in heaven and began marrying all of his daughters. And Ike Potter kind of teamed up with his family and friends and teamed up with the Indians to rob the army, blame it on the Mormons, team up with the army. And during the Utah Wars, he was a hated figure. And then during the Black Hawk War, when he threatened to sick Chief Black Hawk on the Mormon settlements, they imprisoned him. And after he was arrested and escaped something like 40 times, they finally sent half a dozen vigilantes to go kill him and his accomplices. The advance party of Mormons arrived in Salt Lake Valley in 1847, and pretty much as soon as word got back, a lot of people started coming out from places like Iowa in the early 1850s. And you can look up a lot of these people in the church history database, but you have Lyons from 1852, you have Earl Johnston from July 1853, M. Thomason. So I feel like a lot of this part of the cliff could very easily be from the Mormon explorers who were some of the first people to come out here, apart from the fur trappers.
To stumble across this, which I had bookmarked in the past and I really wanted to see, but it's the site of the 1825 Rocky Mountain Rendezvous. And these rendezvous would continue for decades until they finally teetered off in the 1840s and 50s. But it's said that William Ashley realized the importance of meeting the Rocky Mountain sort of mountain men out here, because every year they would have to travel all the way back to St. Louis, Missouri, drop off their furs, and at the time, Missouri was sort of the edge of Western civilization for the United States, and the West was truly wild. And it's said that in 1825, and at every subsequent Mountain Man Fair, that there were hundreds of people, specifically 800 were here. And they said that the whiskey flowed freely, and they openly admitted in their journals that more civilized societies would look upon them and think, these men are barbarians, but they would practice their survival skills, test each other's marksmanship, just go over their stories with the Native Americans, because at the time in the early 1820s, they were very friendly with the Native Americans. And a lot of these men, including Jim Bridger, who was still very green behind the ears when he came to this Rocky Mountain Festival, they were very new to the whole scene. And so 800 men, women, and children came out here, and you know, Ashley left with $50,000 worth of furs, heading back for St. Louis. And at the time, $50,000 would make you a king out here. And it's fascinating to think of the kind of merriment that went on in 1825, back when this territory, I believe, was claimed by the Hudson's Bay Company and the American Fur Company, and the warfare was generally waged between these fur companies, and the U.S. government had very little presence out here on the plains.
The first Rocky Mountain Rendezvous, which was a sort of gathering of all of these fur traders and wild men and explorers, French people, Englishmen who came down from Oregon Territory, and people who just wanted to live off the grid, as well as friendly Native Americans, happened in 1825. But they found an easier spot to meet here in 1833 at the confluence of the Horse Creek and the Green River. Very easy to go along the Green River, and then you just turn right on Horse Creek, and here you are. And there were 6 of the 16 Rocky Mountain rendezvous held along the bank right here. And by 1840, the fur trade was collapsing because they had found easier networks to obtain these furs, and they were sort of going out of style at the time. But it would be here that Jim Bridger and Kit Carson would party, and these were, by all accounts, debaucherous meetings. They lasted for up to a month. They would go through just piles of booze. They would gamble. They would go into their teepees, have sex, and then do business deals. Jim Bridger, I believe, got a Native American wife here by shooting a competitor who was abusing her, and she went over to Jim Bridger and they became lifelong partners. And it was here that the first Scottish tourist, or the first tourist of Wyoming, came through. He wrote poems about it. It wasn't just a business meeting per se. A lot of artists came through, and the earliest women to pass through here were preachers, some of the first women to make it to the American West. Over here is the confluence of the Horse Creek and the Green River, where the Rocky Mountain rendezvous were held. And right over here, next to the sign, we have a monument to the first women along the old Oregon Trail who were also missionaries. It was Narcissa Whitman and Eliza Hart Spalding. They came here and they were some of the first people who proselytized to the Native Americans, but the first women in the American West. And it's fascinating to think that in this town of less than 300 people nowadays, there would have been these huge meetings. And actually only a mile south of town, the first Catholic Mass in the American West, or in the state of Wyoming, was held by Father Jean de Smet, which I'll talk about in just a minute. About 2 miles up the road from where I'm standing right now is the town of Daniel, Wyoming, and it stands at the confluence of the Horse Creek and the Green River, where 6 Rocky Mountain rendezvous were held between 1833 and 1840. And it was at the last one of these rendezvous that Reverend Pierre de Smet, a missionary from Europe who had come over in 1821, gave the first Catholic Mass in what is now Wyoming. And at this Rocky Mountain rendezvous, it said that 2,000 Native Americans, along with a huge smattering of fur trappers and Rocky Mountain wild men, people who were dying off because the fur trade was collapsing, they all prostrated themselves at an altar that de Smet had made out of native stone and decorated with flowers. And this was the first time that Catholic Mass was held here, and he said that it touched his heart. And he was called amongst the Indians the sincerest friend. If you follow the road a little bit further down, overlooking the town, you have the de Smet Monument. And this was made in 1940 on the 100th anniversary of the Mass that was held here. And it's still a very beautiful place and sacred to a lot of Catholics out west. And you have to remember, too, that there weren't too many missionaries out here.